Hello and welcome to another episode of It's Not That Simple. Today we're going to focus our attention on international corruption, and our star guest is Professor Ricardo Soares de Oliveira, a distinguished scholar and leading authority in international relations. Ricardo is Professor of Political Science at the Institut d'Études Politiques in Paris and also a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. He is the author of several influential works, including acclaimed books and numerous articles, and his expertise is regularly sought by policymakers and international organizations who are dealing with complex global challenges. Today, in this episode, we'll be looking at how corruption is not merely a localized problem confined within national borders, but rather a deeply entrenched and global phenomenon distorting markets, undermining democratic institutions, and often it really has its most severe impact on the most vulnerable populations. Ricardo, thank you so much for being here on this show. Welcome. Let's start with the basics. I'd like you to define in your own words really what is international corruption and why it's not that simple.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think a lot of the times corruption has been discussed as a governance problem, essentially as a domestic problem. And we need to unpack that assumption. By governance, we used to mean the governance of individual countries, sort of the Transparency International approach in which you would rank different states. And of course, the Congo would come at the bottom and Switzerland would probably come at the top. But I think over the years, we've realized that it's much better to think of corruption as a global governance issue, and in many ways a structural feature of the global economy. In that sense, the global economy is wired in a way that is structurally enabling of corruption. How does this happen? Through creating the conditions for capital mobility, essentially, by the specific role of offshore jurisdictions, which is, I think, something we're going to get into in a little bit. Offshore jurisdictions in particular enable non-residents to access lax regulations, low to non-existent taxation, easy incorporation rules, and especially the conditions of secrecy that are crucial for turning stolen wealth into legitimate wealth. So for me, when I think of corruption, I think of that transnational reality and not the traditional idea that some countries are corrupt, some cultures are corrupt, and that corruption is essentially a local matter. Far from that.
Okay, perfect. I think that sets the table very well for the conversation we'll have. And touching on that transnational corruption and the issues that arise there, do you think that it really has become embedded in the global financial system rather than being an exception to it in contemporary times?
It's to a very large extent embedded in the global financial system, not as the exception, but as a rule. And by saying this is not the same as saying that the global financial system is entirely rotten to the core. Rather, what I mean is that there are aspects of the global financial system that are strictly speaking legal, but can and are exploited routinely for illegal purposes.
Okay.
I am referring here to a whole panoply of instruments such as shell companies, such as tax avoidance strategies, many of which are legal, the use of trusts, and more generally, the international use of international trade repurposed for money laundering. And the relationship between these two dimensions, the legal and the illegal, is very symbiotic, and the boundaries are very elusive. But it really permeates the global financial system as a whole, rather than being an exception to the rule. Let me clarify one thing here, though. By thinking that this is a structural feature of the global financial system, I'm not at all thinking about it in fatalistic terms. I think that these conditions that enable corruption can be tackled, and to some extent one is trying to tackle them. But they certainly are more deeply embedded than we should have thought about it 20, 30 years ago, in which we thought that the global financial system was mostly good, and that there were these sort of residual practices of an illegal nature that could be dealt as such at the margins of the system. That is not an accurate description of how things work.
Ricardo, obviously you've had a lot of experience with this issue, and I wanted to get your opinion on how geographically the perspectives regarding corruption have evolved? Because maybe I could speculate and say that traditionally there are countries and regions of the world that are more dedicated to fighting corruption, and others that are not. I don't know if that's still fair to say these days, and characterize Western governments, for example, as being more dedicated to shutting down corruption than other governments in other areas of the world or in other continents, or if you feel that it's really an issue that is affecting governments and processes everywhere.
Well, corruption is certainly something that affects states worldwide and impacts greatly, for instance, in the case of Africa, on the revenue that African states have available for the purposes of running their own country. So the problem is global. The fight against corruption, though, you're right in emphasizing the primarily Western origins of the fight against corruption. Both the discourse and some of the signature policies against corruption in the last 20 years have primarily emanated from Western Europe and North America. But, and if not from their governments, certainly from their media, their civil societies, their public intellectuals. But Western countries are not united in any way around a consistent anti-corruption agenda. The obvious point to note here is that the United States, for long a champion of some aspects of the anti-corruption struggle, not others, is now gone from this arena. It's become quite an adversarial presence, in fact. It has reneged since January 2025 on some of its long-standing commitments, and now stands for pretty much the opposite of what it used to. But even within the broader context of Western states, you've had historically states like the United Kingdom or Switzerland, which are quote-unquote progressive states in many ways, but which have sought to defend their financial sectors, and in particular their offshore financial sectors, to such an extent that they were not champions of financial reform, especially at the level of transparency when it comes to the anti-corruption struggle. So there's a fair bit of hypocrisy. Another dimension of that hypocrisy is, of course, not just the protection of their own business interests, but the protection of specific geopolitical alliances. Mm-hmm. Perhaps small countries would be targeted as quote-unquote corrupt, and deservedly so in many instances, but geopolitical allies, for instance, in the Persian Gulf, engaging in very much the same activities, but perhaps on a much larger scale than other smaller countries, would not be sort of decried as such, because larger set of interests was at stake when it came to those countries. That said, so I think we need to think of the West as primarily a progressive actor in this arena would be an overstatement.
Right.
On the other hand, the fact that some states have absolutely no role in the anti-corruption struggle and have indeed benefited a lot from global corruption and the infrastructure that has enabled global corruption. I'm thinking here of countries like Russia, like Iran, like China, etc. It's not wrong to highlight the fact that they don't play any role in these debates. So the Western role, hypocritical, double-faced, and sometimes sincere. The role of other rising powers, more consistently skeptical of structural reform in the international financial system, which is rather surprising if you think that they often articulate a revisionist approach to the Western-built international order. This is an arena in which they're much less critical.
It's interesting what you say about the role of Western governments, and you mentioned the United States and what has changed since the second term of President Donald Trump. And it would be fair to say that a lot of times you can tell what the kind of climate is regarding, or the opinions is regarding corruption in the free role of the media. And what we have seen increasingly in more countries, even in the Western Hemisphere, is to try to control the media as much as possible and replace it with propaganda and replace it with fiction over facts. And you know, this is a big problem of our society generally these days, is telling the difference between opinions and propaganda and facts. I wanted to get your view on how the rise of populist leaders around the world has affected the anti-corruption efforts globally, and also affected the role of institutions such as Transparency International.
Well, it's important to note that even before this backlash, which you, Pedro, you just described very well, this anti-corruption agenda was piecemeal. I already highlighted the fact that countries like Russia, China were never stakeholders in these reform agendas. I've also highlighted the fact that in the West itself, there was a fair amount of hypocrisy and double dealing. What's happened in the last 5 years, though, is even that hypocrisy and double dealing is increasingly replaced by skepticism within the West about some of these anti-corruption measures. Perhaps in the case of the United States, by arguing that some of these laws were restricting the competitiveness of domestic firms. For instance, why shouldn't Western firms engage in corruption in Africa if Asian firms are said to routinely do so? They would be harming their own interests there. So you have that sort of realpolitik critique. You also have a more general retreat from the normative agendas of the liberal decades that are just standing behind us. It was just yesterday in historical terms, but we're indeed in 2025 in a very different world. I don't think that there's a particular targeting of the anti-corruption agenda, as opposed to, for instance, the climate agenda or other progressive agendas of recent years. But there is a sweeping critique of the role of NGOs, the role of progressive advocacy, and in the context of that sweeping critique, international corruption organizations, even those that have always held themselves to strenuously centrist systemic standards that are not considered radical in any way, even they are suffering today in two very, very measurable ways. One is that there's less funding coming to them. And second, that there's less traction when it comes to their access to policymakers, and most importantly, to trying to make their case with the decision makers. I think in the case of the US, a lot of that anti-corruption agenda, sometimes called anti-kleptocracy agenda, was brought into the mainstream of conversations at the level, for instance, of the Biden administration under the guise of national security. That corruption was bad for US national security. It worked as an argument during the Biden years. It doesn't seem to work anymore. So generally, we're facing a retreat of, if not the importance that media and public opinions give to the matter of corruption, then at least to the capacity to influence decision makers to take reformist measures to stem the problem of corruption.
Let's talk a little bit about offshore secrecy and tax havens. I wanted to get your view on a trend that we've seen occurring in recent years, where they're shifting from the Caribbean and Switzerland, tax havens that is, to the Middle East. Why has the Gulf become the new center of offshore wealth?
Well, that's an excellent question. This is a process that is in motion. I still think of it not in terms of shifting from one to the other, but in terms of a process of global diversification of offshore. If you were thinking about it 20, 30 years ago, offshore financial centers were essentially a matter of some European jurisdictions, think Switzerland, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg on the one hand, and then a series of Caribbean jurisdictions, which used to be or still are British colonies. And that was the offshore world for the most part. In the last 20 years, you see places like Dubai, but also places like Singapore, increasingly places like Hong Kong, on a different scale, a place like Mauritius, becoming much more important, and more important especially for clients from the non-West, from the global South in particular. And the reasons for that are, I think there are many reasons, but you could sort of think of them in terms of supply and demand. At the level of supply, it's pretty straightforward that these states, I'm thinking here in particular the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, have really gone out of their way to establish very competitive jurisdictions in a way to undercut others, like Switzerland, for instance, and provide regulations, taxation, and conditions of secrecy that are even sort of outbidding Switzerland, as it were. So from that perspective, they've really made an effort and reaped the benefits of creating these incentives. The supply is also driven by a curious phenomenon, which I've been researching a lot recently, which is the extent to which service providers in the West, I'm thinking lawyers, wealth managers, bankers, management consultants, all sorts of professional services, which are much more strenuously regulated now in places like Geneva, places like London, places like Lisbon. What they do is they offshore their own service provision and go off and offer these services from the new locations. So, for instance, Swiss wealth managers have been expanding massively in a place like Dubai, right? So that's another form of supply that is increasing from these new financial centers. On the demand side, you have two things. You have a lot of corporations that, for instance, invest in so-called frontier markets in places like Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and especially Africa and the Middle East. They don't want to go and invest directly into these economies. So they use places like Dubai as transit jurisdictions that make it, even from a legal perspective, safer to invest in those frontiers markets. So there's a big corporate interest there, but there's also an interest from so-called high net worth individuals from the global South. It's a slight caricature, but in the old days, you could walk out of Geneva airport with bags full of money and go to your Swiss banker and deposit money there. That was the 80s, that was the 90s, that was probably the early 2000s. You can't do that anymore in places like Switzerland, but you can do that in other places. So in a way, as high net worth individuals from places like sub-Saharan Africa have found it more difficult to use services, especially to bank in European and North American jurisdictions, these other places have opened up that are more user-friendly from their perspective. So that's one of the demand dynamics. All of these points put together mean that you have a real dynamic now, especially in the Gulf, that is really, really, really changing scale as we speak, and becoming very important, certainly for the neighboring economies, as it has been the case for 2-3 decades, but increasingly globally.
You've mentioned Africa a couple of times during our conversation. It's often seen as a battleground of sorts for influence between global powers. How does corruption shape this geopolitical competition, in your view?
Well, it's difficult to say that under the current conditions of significant geopolitical competition between the United States and China, obviously, but there's now a plethora of actors that are significant as investors and as trade partners in sub-Saharan Africa. Think anyone from Turkey to Qatar to the United Arab Emirates to Malaysia to India to Brazil, etc. It's very difficult to say that now they brought corruption with them, whereas before, say, for instance, foreign investors in sub-Saharan Africa didn't engage in those practices. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you look at the years from, say, 1960 to the year 2000, these were decades in which essentially the entirety of foreign direct investment into Africa came from the West or close to it. And a lot of the trade with Africa was Western-centric. Corruption was very much part of the deal. But there's no doubt that if the new partners of Africa, and especially the Asian large economies that are now such a significant part of African trade and investment, if they didn't bring corruption with them, neither did they bring a uniquely honest approach to business. And this has to be said because when you hear, especially from the Chinese perspective, they articulate a posture that is often that of the anti-West or the non-West, that whereas the West brought historically all sorts of problems into Africa, from imperialism and colonialism to just the underdevelopment that characterized Africa for many years, China is the bearer of gifts. It's an altruistic partner whose greatest, impulse is to try and develop the continent. That's wildly inaccurate also as a representation of the new players in Africa. The new players are often the same as the old players. They're interested in the same sectors that Western investors have always been interested in Africa. I'm thinking oil, gas, mining, and primarily a bit of agriculture. And they bring with them practices that are rhetorically different, but which are often substantially similar to those that Westerners used to engage in for many decades. And corruption is one of them, especially the buying of political access, the payment of, let's call it, consulting fees to influential decision makers on the continent who may be gatekeepers for particular opportunities in business, especially in large projects in infrastructure, in oil, gas, and mining, etc. So I would say that the situation is not drastically different from it was 2 or 3 decades ago, but in a landscape that is much more complex and diversified because the number of players involved is unprecedented.
No, that's understood, and it's obviously complex. I wanted to get your view on how African countries can escape the cycle of natural resource dependency and elite capture and foreign influence, and also get your perspective on what's happening with the Portuguese-speaking African countries and the relationship that it has with Portugal and how it navigates that, especially when you mentioned there are new competitors on the continent, right? So how do they deal with that dynamic?
I think we have 2 questions there.
Yeah,
the question
we definitely do.
It's a very wide-ranging one. I would just say that for many years, academics and specialists focused on resource wealth in developing contexts as a curse. In other words, that there was a paradoxical outcome that a country that was rich in natural resources would end up poorer and with more political instability than if it had been just a resource-poor country, right? Hence the resource curse. I think over the years we realized there's no curse. There's a strongly recurrent pattern whereby countries that are resource-rich end up not with happy outcomes. But there's no fatalism to it. There are decisions that are taken on the part of investors and on the part of governing elites. And that's why, in fact, even in sub-Saharan Africa, where it is normally assumed that natural resource leads to corruption, leads to underdevelopment, we have countries that are resource-rich and that have done a good amount with the resources that accrue to them. I'm thinking here of Botswana. I'm thinking here of Namibia. I'm thinking here of the recent development of oil in Ghana, which is certainly better managed than in places like Nigeria or Angola or elsewhere. So, and if we look globally, you see even in the global south, countries like Chile, countries like Indonesia, countries like Malaysia, they're resource rich. And they've managed to develop in a sustainable, very positive way in the last 50 to 60 years. So outcomes are varied. And I think that we need to put more emphasis on the choices that are made by decision makers in particular. And I think that this brings us to the Lusophone African context. I think that a lot of the choices that could have been made in countries like Angola, which for some time has benefited from quite a unusual amount of revenues in oil, in terms of its oil sector, especially from 2004 to 2014. Those opportunities were not seized. The choices that were made were not the right choices, and the results are quite dismal in terms of national development. Specifically, the question you asked me about Lusophone Africa and Portuguese relations with their former colonies. I think that obviously there is a much enlarged landscape. In particular, in the case of Angola, China has gone from not really being a presence in the 1990s to being Angola's largest trading partner and also largest source of credit. So the landscape has changed. I'm not sure if that is the factor that has affected relations with Portugal most, because those relations seem to have their own dynamic, and their positives and negatives seem less related to the presence of others, but to the nature of the relationship itself. And I can explain that in a second. On the positive side of post-colonial relations between Portugal and and Lusophone Africa, there are at least two aspects that I would emphasize as very positive. The first one is that Lusophone African countries do not see Portugal as a threat in any way, shape, or form. This is in stark contrast to what you saw, for instance, in the relationship between France and its former colonies. France was, for most of the last 60 years, an overbearing presence and was perceived as a sort of new colonial threat to many countries in Francophone Africa. Portugal has had a relationship that is not motivated by imperial design, neither is it perceived as such. And this calibrates the relationship at a level which I think is positive. The second dimension is that if you think about how decolonization happened, very tragic, very traumatic context in the mid-1970s, in the fullness of time, Portugal and the Lusophone African countries managed to rebuild a relationship in which at least part of that traumatic end of empire was healed, and the relationship, I think, is constructive in some way. So that's for the positive side. On the negative side, or at least on the problematic side, I see two dynamics which are already serious and of concern, but which may become even more so and undermine the relationship in the coming years and decades. The first one is the perception in many Lusophone African countries, again, Angola looms large in this regard, that Portuguese authorities established a close relationship not with these countries, but with their ruling elites, and in particular with the ruling parties. In the case of Angola, the MPLA, in the case of Mozambique, with Frelimo, to the detriment of the societies in these countries, but also to the detriment of the political oppositions in these countries. And the second dynamic that is of concern to me is the corollary of the first, which is that there's a perception, not entirely inaccurate, that Lisbon is a sort of gateway for capital flight away from these countries and into the global financial economy. In other words, that much of the money laundering of stolen assets from Lusophone Africa happens, or has happened historically, especially until about a decade ago, via Lisbon and via service providers in Lisbon, with the implicit acceptance by Portuguese authorities of this role. Now, the two dynamics put together, I think is already a source of concern to many people in these countries, but may undermine the previous points that I made, that the relationship is fairly good, fairly stable, less, if you will, rancorous than is the case between African countries and their former imperial powers, Belgium, France, the UK, etc. But if this relationship is not nurtured, and if some of these aspects that I've just referred to are not addressed, there's the possibility that this relationship would deteriorate in the coming years.
Well, thank you so much for giving us that insight, and I think it helps to explain the dynamic and some of the challenges that are there, not just historically, but in contemporary times, in the relationship that Africa and several of its countries have with its partners. We're running out of time here, Ricardo. I did, before I go into the quick fire questions, just very quickly, I did want to touch on cryptocurrencies because we haven't talked about that yet, and I just wanted to get your view on how much of a genuine threat that continues to be, and how criminal networks are really utilizing crypto to bypass anti-money laundering systems. If you can tell us that in a minute or two to complete this picture, I'd appreciate that.
Thank you, Pedro. I think that cryptocurrency is a problem. And I think that those who are concerned with it are also concerned because they see meaningful global regulation as well nigh impossible under the current political circumstances of a United States government that supports crypto, and the fact that just collective action in the international financial system seems to be further and further away from the realm of possibilities. On the other hand, I push back slightly against two things. The first one is that crypto is a uniquely unprecedented weakness. I think crypto clearly compounds, it adds to weaknesses that are already there. And the anti-money laundering system that you outlined earlier, which was built up almost from scratch in the last 30 years, is so loophole-ridden that the idea that everything was going well and we're stemming the problem of money laundering, and now crypto comes along and everything is up for grabs, I think that's inaccurate. That was never the case. But there are real risks, and you can see again in sub-Saharan Africa, the use of crypto, especially in failed states like the Central African Republic, in places like Nigeria. You have crypto appealing both for its own reasons, but also as an alternative to the existing and very moribund financial systems. So I do think it's a matter of concern. In a way, I'm integrating it into the analysis. I'm also skeptical about placing crypto in this sort of role as a convenient scapegoat. But I do think going forward, it's a major concern. And for me, it's a major concern precisely because I think that no one's going to be intervening in this market, that this market is going to run amok before, again, before it comes to a crash, but a crash which is very different from what we saw around 2019, 2020, but something much more concerning because much more global, much more widely disseminated than was the case even 5 years ago.
Okay, well, I'm glad we got that important topic in here right before the close of the show. I did want to make a transition into our quick fire questions. So in one sentence maximum, I'd like you to answer these four questions. What is one personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having, and why?
Patience and lucidity. I go with two traits. Patience, because we're going through a moment in which just reactiveness might give rise to impulse rather than reflection. And lucidity, because political passions are so red hot these days that, again, a careful counsel, a good interpretation of events requires a certain distancing from those events.
Clear. What is the biggest challenge that humanity is facing right now?
Two challenges: climate change, obviously, but also the risk of a large systemic war, especially in the European theater.
Wow. If you could change one thing in the world by magic today, what would that be?
I would drastically reduce the scope of offshore financial centers, especially their provision of secrecy, which has all sorts of negative global impacts on development.
All right, that's pretty specific and clear. What is the most important learning of your life and career?
I think the most important learning of my life and career is perhaps a rueful, retrospectively sad learning, which is that taking for granted global mobility, functioning institutions, the rule of law, democracy as a one-way street, all of that is up for grabs. That was overly optimistic in retrospect. I think every generation needs to reinvent those public goods. It needs to fight for the maintenance of decent societies. They don't come spontaneously in the human history. And I think we're going to have to do that all over again.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing your answers on this quick fire, which is always really interesting to get our star guests' perspectives on. We've gone over time, but I think we managed to get most of the topics, most of the questions in pertaining to this complex subject of international corruption. It was a pleasure to have you on the show, and all the best, Ricardo.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we close this episode of It's Not That Simple. Hopefully, Ricardo's insight has added value to your understanding of the topic. And now we know, especially after addressing the subject in such a profound manner, why it's not that simple. See you soon.